Welcome to the American Citizens Abroad podcast. I'm Michelle, and today I'm speaking with Susan, the force behind Overseas Vote Foundation. Welcome. Thanks for chatting with us today.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for having me on this podcast. I'm really excited about it.
We're happy to have you here. What motivates you to create the Overseas Vote Foundation, and how is it related to the U.S. Vote Foundation?
That's a story, actually, but it's a story I'd love to tell. About 20 years ago, actually, it is 20 years ago, believe it or not. Well, things weren't going super well in the US, and I thought I got to get involved, do something. So I thought, what better way than to help votes go back to the US? I'll admit, I knew nothing about the process. I knew nothing about how elections worked. I knew nothing about much about politics either. I came out of the software business, but living abroad had opened my eyes. The perspective we have looking from our respective countries back to the US and the kind of dialogue that goes on abroad had made me much more aware of foreign policy and how it affects the world and all the ways that America affects not just Americans living abroad, but everybody. And I thought we need to weigh in. We had had 9/11 and we had had various different administrations. And I thought, maybe the voices from abroad would really add to that decision. So I decided, well, I'll figure out how they can vote. I'll start helping people register to vote. And when I went to a favorite friend of mine who works with the expat community in Munich, his name is Dave Dowdy, exceptional guy, great for another podcast. I went to him and he knows kind of something about everything. And he handed me a stack of blurry sepia print cardstock forms and a 500-page instruction book to go with it. I must admit I was a bit shocked. And that was kind of the beginning. And then I tried to get educated on how does all that work and sat through some workshops and found out there were all kinds of exceptions, but they were very strange. This state, you have to do this, and this state, you have to do that. But it was one form. And I thought, okay, and the instruction book and where to send the forms was written down in there. I'll go out and try to just start registering voters at events, which I did. And I realized we were getting nowhere fast. So I just said, wait a minute, there's a better way to do things. This must be online. But when I went to look, it wasn't there, which for a person like me just spelled opportunity. And I thought, well, how about if I fix that problem? I ended up becoming the first person to ever put the overseas and military voter registration and ballot request process online. And that was the beginning of 20 years of an amazing experience. And we still have overseasvotefoundation.org. I welcome you to go there. We've reinvented it this year. It is designed to be a place where long-term overseas voters can go, but also somebody who's never done it before, the minute they land on it, they should feel like, I landed in the right place. The first thing it tells you is your right to vote goes with you wherever you are in the world. Well, going back to the story, we put that process online. We put the emergency ballot process online. We started the election official directory because most of the addresses in that book were wrong, out of date. And that election official directory is now licensed to every major voter outreach organization in the US. It was our first big election database. We now have others that move out through APIs to other organizations. So we're feeding other organizations. And we continued to do things. And then in 2009, 5 years later, Congress had taken note of what we had done. They saw that the program could be modernized, and they codified that in the MOVE Act, the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act, which passed in 2009, which basically modernized the overseas and military voting law and process with that. It gave us tremendous benefits as overseas voters. We have truly the very best voting program available in the United States. If you go on our website today to register and request your ballot, it's one process. It's not two forms. In the US, they have to file two forms. It's one process. You can go through the process in a few minutes online. For most states, with a few exceptions because of the laws in that state, you can apply your signature to the form and send it to the election office through our system, 100% online, no printing, no scanning, done. There is no other equivalent domestically. Also, you have the right to receive your blank ballot online, which in most cases you should be ready, prepared to print it and return it by post. But still, if you've requested it earlier than 6 weeks prior to the election, as of that day of 45 days, 6 weeks prior to the election, every state must be able to send us our ballots. If you ask for it online, you're going to get it that day. If you ask for it by mail, it depends on the mail system, but there's still plenty of time to vote and get it back. That's the kind of benefit we have. Pretty soon after 2009, being in the software business, you have it pounded into you to keep doing new stuff. I was running out of problems to solve, to put it mildly. And I started to look at, okay, look what we have going for us here abroad. We have a nice selection of comprehensive services for overseas voters and the information. What do they have domestically? What can we bring there? Well, we have, of course, the absentee ballot request expertise. We looked at the domestic situation and said, hey, we have something to offer. And because we were in this area of election data, I mentioned the election official directory. It contains 7,500 records to all the election offices in the US. And it is very complete. Every record has your election official by name. It has email, phone, fax. It's got all the addresses, all of that. Yeah, that kind of data was desirable. Having it come from an organization that was named Overseas Vote Foundation wasn't really ideal. So that situation, coupled with the fact that we wanted to bring our expertise to the US voters as well, stimulated the move to US Vote Foundation as our parent organization. And Overseas Vote is now an initiative under it. We're all one, right? It's technicality. So US Vote Foundation, however, is a superset of all services. It can welcome all voters, domestic, overseas, polling place, early voting, absentee voting, you name it, military voters and their families as well. So that is what I would call our umbrella brand. And US Vote Foundation is where all the moving parts are, all the applications and things that move around. Overseas Vote is dedicated to overseas voters and giving more information that you would ever even think of asking, because we know it from our 20 years of being in the position of being overseas voters. And then we have a third new website and some very exciting news, and that's US.vote. It's a .vote domain. And there we have 100% outreach tools and civic engagement tools, programs, campaigns. And that's a very long answer. You got the whole story.
It is amazing. You're absolutely right. What are the trends you are seeing in voting both domestically in the US and overseas?
Well, since 2020, there is an undeniable increase in traffic. Certainly, it has to do with what our websites offer. But I'm going to look chiefly at US Vote Foundation when I refer to any kind of trends here, because that's where the people are coming to look up eligibility, create a form, generate a ballot request, look at where's my ballot chart, sign up for ballot tracking, check something, their voter registration status, whatever. We would have been happy in a year to have the kind of traffic that we have now in just the first few months of the year. I would say that out of the horror of COVID, in 2020, the world slowed down, but people really paid a lot more attention to what was going on the political scene and what was available to them voting wise. And that's when we saw the likes of 3 million voters coming on our website. We hadn't seen that before. Now we have more than that. We're up about 15 100%, so 1,500%. Now we have more than 3 million. We have about 3.6 million in just the first half year, and that's going to go up exponentially going forward in this second half of the year. We know that. That is the collection of voters. Overseas voters for us represent a full 50% of our traffic and the generation of forms, etc. We really have a very balanced usage of our site between domestic and overseas.
For the overseas voting registrations, are you seeing an increase or decrease for those for the upcoming election?
We won't see a super increase for a while. Voters are slow. They will take a bit. We're very much on pace with what would be expected. There's no alarm one way or another. There are certain events that cause voters to kind of go and get more active. And this year, we saw a lot of activity, for example, around Super Tuesday. Unfortunately, a lot of the energy went out of the balloon. It's now picking up again with recent events, the debate, the Supreme Court. You start to see each one of these events actually reverberates around the world. So I would just say we're right on track, and I can't, honestly, it would be incorrect to make predictions at this point. We're very pleased with the progress, the trend, and we have very high expectations for increased participation.
What surveys and research have you done on voting? We know you usually do a post-election survey, but have you done any other studies?
We have chiefly focused on that. Within that, we do ask voters their opinions on certain issues, such as in 2020, we really went much more down in the weeds on that survey to ask people how they were feeling about election integrity, about issues like will their ballot be counted and things like that. That survey is up on our website. If you go to usvotefoundation.org and you scroll to the very bottom, under initiatives on the footer of usvotefoundation.org, there's the research program first. It isn't yesterday's report, but the 2020 Election Day voter experience study was pretty thorough, covering opinions in how people felt about confidence in the voting method by political party, by gender. So, and then election integrity and things like that, voting method, faith in the electoral system. We did get into that. We also got into how they feel about certain reforms. There is a section for overseas voters in there. So I would recommend, if you want more information on that, to look there.
Along the lines of voting integrity, and without getting too political, do you think U.S. citizens still have confidence in the voting system?
I know the facts. The facts are that election officials work so hard and they count every ballot. By law, there is not a ballot that goes uncounted. You cannot certify an election without counting all the ballots. You have to account for them. I hope so, I guess is my answer, because it is not the fault of the election officials. Unfortunately, propaganda and self-serving attitudes cover the airwaves, and just the fact that it's a question that our elections aren't integrous is a tragedy, I see. If you survey people, for the most part, they still do. By a majority do believe in the integrity of elections. I don't think they've personally been shown that elections are in some way corrupted. They may have been told by self-interested people and parties. So it depends a lot on conspiracy theories that they're exposed to or personal whims. But the truth is, our elections are pretty darn good in the US. They're somewhat low tech in some ways, which I think is a plus versus a minus. Meaning I don't believe that putting voting online real time would help us. That hasn't been proven secure. If it did move that way, then I would get worried. but it is now still largely paper ballots counted, even if they go through a scanner.
Many US citizens don't register to vote because they think their vote doesn't count or won't have an impact. What do you say to those people?
I say not voting is voting. By not casting your ballot, you're giving the power of your voice to someone else and expecting them to take care of you. I don't think you can expect that. People don't vote because they haven't connected what elected officials and the decisions of elected officials and how they affect them in particular. That's where I think overseas voters have an advantage that we often see through foreign policy decisions, how we are affected, how we are looked at, how we are considered. So we feel it maybe more directly. Very often, people in the US no longer have any kind of civic education. They don't know that the decisions of the attorney general in their state or their congressperson can affect them in very, very substantial ways, down to whether the potholes in their street are fixed or whether their kid has school lunch. It's unfortunate, but that lack of a connection from one end to the other often makes people think their voice doesn't matter. But not voting is voting. Right now, overseas citizens, our turnout rate in the best of times, at the highest point, has only been 7.8% of the overall overseas eligible voter population. And that's tragic. We have the best, most automated, most efficient voting program out there. Go online, you find it on government sites, private websites like ours, political sites. You have so much available to you. There is no excuse. We could double it so easily. Let me assure you, too, the idea that your ballot isn't counted is false. And if you go on overseasvotefoundation.org, we have a page for myths versus facts. That is one of the misconceptions that keeps people from voting. We're trying to address those on the myths versus facts page because there's so many of those things that keep people from voting. And it really is tragic. Little things like I need a previous voting record in the US to vote abroad. No. I need a fixed overseas address to vote abroad. No, you could be traveling. You could be at school. I have to be worried about taxes. I need to have a property or a current address in the US. All these things are false and more. And it goes on. These are the things that stay in the way of people participating from abroad. Like I said, I'm going back to the first statement. It's a tragedy because not voting is voting. The razor thin margins, we can fill them. I looked at this last week. What was the margin of victory in 2020 between the two presidential candidates? And were the requested overseas ballots more than that? I only looked at the swing states for 2024, looked at the past numbers for 2020 and considered that for just the swing states of 2024. And already I could see that in 4 states, we had a larger number of overseas ballots requested than the margin of victory in those swing states. If we were to double from 7.8, and let me tell you, that wouldn't be hard if we just get to it. We have the services. We don't need reform in terms of what's available to us now. We would have a really, really big impact. You can count on me here. I'll put my hand on the Bible. Your ballot will be counted.
And along those lines, how can organizations like ACA get members and Americans overseas more interested in voting and motivated to vote? Do you have any suggestions?
Yes, I think we have to ask for the order. One of the reasons overseas voters don't vote is no one asks them to do so. We need to stop allowing this. Now, I don't mean pass a law, but there are a lot of times when we have elected officials coming abroad. Do they say, hey, all you citizens out there, remember, request your ballot this year? It matters. No, they don't. We need to do that for ourselves if they're not going to do it for us. We need a louder campaign. We need to call for the vote. We need to expose it. There's no excuse anymore. There really isn't. We just have to ask and acknowledge that our community is here. We have a program. We have our right to vote intact. It's federally protected, and we have the services we need. So that's what I would say. Now, one of the things we're trying to do to encourage that, we've created a new tool. It's really fun to use. It's called the Voter Journey Map. We're announcing it tomorrow on July 4th to all of our subscribers on our mailing list, but we will, of course, provide ACA and any other organization with a banner or a button or a QR code. What it does is it is an interactive, dynamic experience where you as a voter, you start into a process that we call your voter journey, and you take it step by step. At the other end, you come out with your map, which is your customized checklist of your places and things you need to go and what you need to do to get voting this year. We're hoping that transforms the process from what has been in most every instance where you get to a how to vote page, even on our own US Vote site, US Vote Foundation right now. The how to vote guide is static, but the voter journey map is not, and it gives you a customized map. These static lists you have to work your way through, and they're a mile long, and it's very confusing and full of jargon. We've tried to strip the process of tedium and boredom and mystery and the overwhelming nature of it and make it into a completely different experience. Somewhat immersive. It doesn't take long. It's only about probably 5 minutes for the average voter. But there is a path exclusively for overseas voters to take. And you can get there at us.vote/how-to-vote. But you can just go to us.vote. That's the simplest URL imaginable. 2 letters, us.vote. There you can get to create your journey map, and it opens up and you're on your way. And that's the kind of thing we need to do. We need to innovate, we need to get loud, and we need to ask for the order.
Often information on candidates for Congress and the presidency isn't as available overseas as it is in the US. How can US citizens overseas inform themselves about the candidates running?
Great question. And that's a service we have. You just go to usvotefoundation.org and you can click into under charts and resources. Across the top, there are just 4 items. One of them is charts and resources. And on that list is the sample ballot lookup. And that will tell you about your candidates, about what's on your ballot, constitutional amendments, ballot measures, what have you. It's all there. It is so easy right now to get information about candidates, but you need to probably wait a little while to get your ballot. You can still research candidates. You know what state you're voting in. You can assume a few things and you can get going on that. You can go to a site like votesmart.org. They have candidate information. But the sample ballot tool is what I would recommend when we get a little closer to the election. There's still some state primaries happening, you see. We've had the federal ones, but we have state ones still coming through. Ballots are not finalized for a little while yet. We have the nomination process coming. Although it seems like we know who's going to be running, you really can't confirm that till the conventions happen. So sample ballot lookup is perfect for that. I would say there should be no worry about that right now. Your concern is more to be sure that you file your overseas registration and ballot request form. For most states, that's 100% online at usvotefoundation.org.
How does US voting from overseas differ from overseas voting for other countries? Are there still countries that don't allow their citizens to vote when they are no longer a resident?
That is something that I'm actually not qualified to answer because I haven't researched all these other countries' processes. I'm familiar with many that allow their overseas citizens to vote. For example, we just recently had an EU election citizens from outside of their country. I'll be very specific. I recently was able to acquire my dual citizenship. I'm a Polish citizen and a US citizen. I live in Germany. This was not the EU election, but the Polish election was being held. That was a few months ago. I wanted to vote in that from Germany. Poland had set up polling places all around Munich, and I registered quite easily, and I received my polling place information, and I showed up and I voted. So they had in-person voting. That's one example. Then you've got situations where countries are sending their ballots abroad. My husband is French. He's in the US. He just voted in the French election over the weekend. He actually voted online. It varies. Also, the methods that they use to vote for their citizens abroad vary. There are countries where they're not as kind to overseas voters. For example, in the UK, I do know that you cannot continue to vote as a voter abroad from the UK forever. I think it's only allowed for a few years. But again, these are laws that change, and I'm not really an expert there. So I hesitate to give any real detailed information in terms of our comparison. One thing I can say, not knowing how it stacks up, we're pretty good with our citizens going abroad, having the right to vote. You have the right to vote as an overseas American, even if you've never voted before in your life. You could be 80 years old and never voted before in your life. You're living somewhere abroad and you want to vote for the first time as an overseas voter, you have the right to do so. The one place where we do not have a consistent situation is with children born to American citizens abroad who are American citizens themselves. The right to vote as a federal right granted under UOCAVA, Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, was not bequeathed to all these children through the federal law. That right to vote is extended to children, American children born to Americans abroad in 38 states and DC, but not in 12 states. We have exactly that information that you need, overseasvotefoundation.org. That's an anomaly. American citizens without the right to vote who are abroad, who are children born to other citizens. That's unfortunate. It's something we're working very hard on directly with the White House.
And what can the US learn about voting systems used in other countries?
Again, I'm not an expert there. However, one great example that I have of at least one thing that I wish we would learn would be that we stop asking voters to register and re-register year after year, even if they sometimes miss an election. I'll give the example of Germany, where I know how the system works, where it's more like the job of the election official is to keep you on the voter roll and keep your data up to date. It's not pushed onto the citizen. And that is an unfortunate thing about the US, where we continue to drop voters from the rolls, purge voters from the rolls for this or that reason. And that is a real tragedy. It has infused the public with an uncertainty. It's also an underhanded message of suppression, that you might have done something that you're not aware of and you're not going to be on the voting roll. You don't have a sense of security there. I think that's very unfortunate. It's a great difference. Also, the fact that domestic voters in the US have to vote on a Tuesday. It's illogical. It doesn't make any sense. It keeps so many voters out of the polling place. They have to work, they're away, whatever. And then again, the uneven application of methods of voting. For example, the uneven right to vote by absentee ballot. It is not given to all voters domestically from all states. Some states send all ballots automatically, or all voters get vote by mail ballots. Other states, you have to have what they call an excuse. The variation in laws across the different states makes it very hard for Americans. It gives them a sense of unease. All I can say is we've tried to make it a much more confidence-building process on usvotefoundation.org. It doesn't matter what state you're from. You're going to get information presented in the same way, standardized across all states. You're going to be welcome no matter what type of voter and what state, and you're going to find it in an easy to use format. That is not the case in every state. So as far as the US compared to abroad, many countries have policies that make it easier and make voters feel more confident about voting. They can walk to the polls on a Sunday. They don't have to try to get there on a Tuesday. Things like that. These are technicalities maybe and practicalities, but they do have an impact.
Any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'd love your feedback on the voter journey map. I'm going to ask you all, everybody, to do it once and share it 10 times. I'm going to ask you to vote this year. Get on the website. Go to usvotefoundation.org. Go to overseasvotefoundation.org. Enjoy your time with the us.vote and the voter journey map and get your ballot in.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for covering this topic.
The American Citizens Abroad podcast is a monthly podcast that is published the second Tuesday of each month. It is edited and produced by me, Michelle, and is a product of American Citizens Abroad. You can find us on Twitter at ACA_podcast, on Facebook at American Citizens Abroad Podcast, or you can email us at podcast@americansabroad.org. Remember, give us a good rating on Apple Podcasts so other Americans living abroad can find us.